Alright, what's up guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're having the third episode of A Thinking Person's Guide to USMLE Prep. The series we try to unravel and really understand what the USMLE is all about so that you can make the best prepping strategy for your particular scenario. And in today's episode, we'll go over the resources and tools available to study for the USMLE. And I just want to let everybody know that in this video, we'll build upon heavily on what we covered in the last episode of the 3 fundamental processes for a successful USMLE prep. So if you haven't watched it, I suggest that you go ahead, watch it, and then come back to this video. Also, quick warning, this will probably end up being quite a lengthy video because we have a bunch of stuff to unpack, but I'll leave some timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to the part that most interests you. Okay, now to kick things off, let's start by talking about one of the most widely used resources out there. Books. And the thing you have to keep in mind about books is that there's actually 2 types of books for the USMLE. The teaching kind and the rapid review kind. The teaching kind, as the name suggests, teach you the subjects. They're often lengthy and they don't mind extending themselves over a few more pages in order to make you fully understand each topic. And here's where you include books such as Crush for the USMLE or the Kaplan lecture notes. On the other hand, the rapid review books are designed more to remind you of the important highlights, of the details and the raw concepts that actually show up in the test. And although they can include a few explanations here and there, they more often than not just state the fact and provide as little background as possible to deliver just the important concept in the most efficient way possible. And here's where you include the famous first aid for the USMLE book. Now, which kind of book is better? Well, neither of them. They focus on different goals. The teaching books are great to make you understand because they are filled with explanations to maximize precisely that. But they are pretty awful when it comes to help you recall or adapt. That's why many people who read, let's say, Kaplan feel awesome while reading the book, but then a few weeks later when they're solving the question banks, they feel terrible because they don't recall a bunch of details that they think they're supposed to know. And it's not their fault. The book is just not optimized to help recall raw data. And in fact, the few extra paragraphs that the book takes to explain topics more thoroughly end up creating a phenomena in which the total number of topics reviewed per unit of time decreases. And as you may remember, one of the keys to optimize memorization is to review as many topics as possible as frequently as possible. The setup of these types of books just literally goes against that. So who should use the teaching type of books? Well, people who have the time and are looking to optimize the understanding front over everything else. The best candidate that comes to mind is someone who just entered medical school and knows close to nothing about medicine, or someone that for some reason has more than a year to prep and feels like his foundations are close to zero. The few extra pages that these books pack can really help in demystifying the USMLE, because I can assure you that for many people that enter this exam, a lot of the content feels just like a bunch of random facts tested one after another. And sure, I'm not gonna deny that there's a bunch of random facts in this exam, but if you manage to scratch a bit beneath the surface, you will often realize that having good foundations often takes you quite a long way and help you deduce a bunch of the details that would otherwise seem just arbitrary. However, these types of books are really not the best use of your time if your problem is in the recalling department, in the adaptation department, or if you just don't happen to have that much time to prep. So if your problem is remembering the stuff you learn, or if you have just a few months to prep, well, reading one of these books is probably not the best idea. Now, the best teaching book, in my personal opinion, and the one I recommend to most people, is Crush for the USMLE. They actually have one book for each step. I have just read some paragraphs and some chapters about step 1 and step 2, but the ones I read were awesome. I just love the way the author explains stuff, and it has taught me a lot of what I know today. Now, regarding the rapid review books, they're kind of a strange animal because, well, yes, they do provide you with all the facts, but they aren't really designed to optimize the understanding front. They just deliver you the facts, which, considering that the USMLE is kind of a script-based exam, seems like an awesome idea. Like, here you have it, 90% of the facts of the concepts that will show up in the exam, all laid down for you with none of the fluff, just all of the raw things that will appear in the exam. Seems like a very appealing idea, right? But here's the catch. We are not designed to learn or remember in that way. The fact of the matter is that just reading a bunch of facts clumped together one after another does not help you understand them any better. And rereading them multiple times is also not optimal to improve memorization, because although you're repeating them constantly, which is the spaced repetition thing that we talked about that optimizes for memory, the process is still very passive, and that doesn't engage your memory as well as the other active recall strategies that we'll discuss in a couple of minutes. So these types of books are really interesting to me because they're not as good as the other books to make you understand, and they're not as good as the other resources to make you recall. So why bother with them? Well, honestly, the only way in which I think that using them can be helpful is by using them as a checklist, like quite literally opening the first aid in your last month of prep and going over the pages thinking to yourself, okay, I know this, I learned this through other means, but oops, I do not know this. I'm going to read a bit about it now and maybe see if I can find some questions about it, because who knows, maybe it will pop up in my exam. But I honestly wouldn't recommend using them in any other way. Again, not because they're bad books. I think it's a fantastic idea to clump all of the important raw facts together, but that just doesn't work as well as people would want it to work. Now, there's a third type of written resource, which are the online libraries, like the one from Ambos, and these ones are great in the sense that finding information is much easier than in a book, and the content is often customizable as well. So for instance, if you want to have more like a rapid review type of experience, you can check the high yield button and just get the main facts. But on the contrary, if you want to have a more in-depth explanation, you can click the clinician button, having like the best of both worlds. These types of features, along with the fancy multimedia embedded in the pages, make the libraries a superior resource to most traditional books, not only for the USMLE, but to learn medicine in general. However, most libraries are paid in a subscription-based manner and thus become quite expensive if you plan to use them in the long term. Additionally, and contrary to the traditional goal of finishing up the book and then moving on to something else, here the content is pretty much infinite, and so trying to finish it up before you move on to, let's say, questions really doesn't make sense. And so I think that if you plan to use a library, it makes so much more sense to use them in an as-needed basis rather than a basis of I'll read everything and then move on to the questions. With this in mind, I would say that medical libraries, and more specifically the Ambos library, is a great resource for everyone to use. That is, as long as you have the cash to afford them. I have a whole walkthrough video on the Ambos library as well as the other features of the Ambos platform, which you can access here or here, one of those places, in case you're interested. But anyways, now we move on to the video resources, and here we have a lot of contenders: Boards and Beyond, Kaplan, USMLE RX, Physio, Pathoma, and although they are quite varied with respect to what they teach and how they do it, they all share the same common goal: making you understand. Now, what is the benefit of these videos over the books in regard to understanding? That sometimes people find easier to understand an animated explanation over a written one. I'm certainly one of those people, and I found that videos were extremely helpful to learn, actually much more so than the books. Some videos also have the benefit of being a bit more concise than your average teaching book, and thus this makes videos the ideal review resource for people who don't have a lot of time to prep but still want to understand the topics well enough. Now, my personal favorite videos are the ones from Boards and Beyond and Pathoma. Boards and Beyond covers pretty much everything, like 95% of everything you'll need to know, and I specifically liked the way in which he was able to explain all the important points without making the videos too long, because other video resources like Kaplan tend to be a bit more lengthy, and I personally wanted to be efficient with my learning without sacrificing the explanations, and B&B just hits the nail in that balance perfectly. Now, Pathoma, as the name suggests, only covers pathology, and although it tends to be a bit more lengthy than Boards and Beyond, I really do think that the time he spends explaining stuff actually teaches you how to think about those topics. Like, not only what are the facts, but how to think about the facts, how to make them second nature, how to navigate through them. In a nutshell, how to make sense of the facts. And that's an invaluable thing to learn, because it lays the foundations for you to handle concepts at will, to make educated guesses. And this is precisely the skill that eventually allows you to make educated guesses and face new scenarios, which in other words is adapt. So this is probably the first resource that we've covered that actually helps you adapt to new scenarios. By the way, Pathoma has also a book, but the book literally says the exact same things that the videos do, so it's totally unnecessary to go through both of them if you just plan to watch the videos. Now, regarding the other video resources, what can I say? Well, I've tried to some extent most of them. Like, for instance, I have found that Physio is a spectacular resource when it comes to, let's say, biochemistry. Sketchy is amazing for learning microbiology and a bit of pharmacology. Kaplan was really nice for the videos I watched, albeit a bit too lengthy for my taste. Osmosis is also awesome. I love the way they teach, but they have way too many videos. So again, I think that trying to go over all of them is kind of an unwise strategy. I've never tried Lecturio, although many friends tell me it's amazing, but overall I would say that the important thing you have to keep in mind about video resources is that they are more similar than they are different. And the actual differences often come in style, not so much in content. So if you want to pick one up but you're not sure about which one should you use, my advice would be to just go to the websites, do a free trial and see which one do you prefer and just stick with it. But if you don't want to do that or you just don't have the time, well, just try out BMB and Pathoma. I always recommend that combo and everybody seems to love it. And well, if you struggle with a few other concepts or subjects, maybe try out the other resources, Osmosis, Sketchy, Physio, and again, because you're struggling in just specific areas, you might as well just do a free trial and work very diligently on that specific area. That usually does the trick for most people. With that clear, now we move on to the category of audiobooks and podcasts, and here I know of a couple. The first one is the Golian audio lectures, and those were just recordings of the classes of a famous pathologist of a few years ago. And to be honest, I actually enjoyed them quite a bit. They are not meant to help you recall information any better, but what I will say is that they did teach me a bit about adapting, because one thing that Golian often does in the lectures is quiz you, is throw you questions out of nowhere and explain how the questions creators think and how they like to trick you and confuse you. And then he explains, well, how can you face those scenarios? So those few teachings were actually tremendously helpful, and I remember that a lot of the times when I faced these difficult questions, the thing that he said came to my mind and helped me pick an answer and often get a bunch of things right even when I didn't have all the facts at hand. However, you have to take into account that this is not a perfect resource, because first of all it's very lengthy, and second of all, well, you cannot see anything. So sometimes Golian says that he's showing something in the screen, and well, since you cannot see any screen, your experience just is not optimal. So my suggestion is to use these audio lectures more of like a passive study tool, like something you do when you're working out or having a drive or going to eat, having lunch, like when you're doing something else. I wouldn't recommend this using as an active resource, as something that you actively take notes on and hear while you're no, that's something a bit more passive. Now, the other audio resource I know of is a podcast called Divine Intervention, which I liked. Again, it's not like you can expect to truly recall or understand deeply the information by just hearing this podcast, but hearing it can certainly be useful to fresh up on some details and be on the lookout for those tips and tricks that Divine often throws out here and there. And yeah, it can be a good add on top of your prep, but again, more like a passive study tool. Okay, now we move on to the next type of resource, which are flashcards. And the first thing you need to understand about flashcards is that they are the first type of tool that we've talked about, whose objective is not to only improve your understanding, but rather to help you recall the information. And that's not only because they make you review the facts repeatedly, as let's say rereading something does, but also because you're forced to remember the concept through a question, actively, and not just through passive review. Those two things, spaced repetition and active recall, are the best two tools we have to improve memorization and retention. Now, there's only one problem with flashcards, and that's that they only improve one type of memorization, which is rote memorization, meaning just the fact, the concept, the detail, the arbitrary fact, and nothing else. Not the context, not the content, not how that specific detail will appear on the test. And so, as we already know from the last video, the concepts do matter. That's what eventually appears, and that's often what the answer choice is. But that's not the hardest part of this exam. The hardest part of this exam is that the same 3 or 4 concepts for each disease appear in different ways, and they like to trick you and confuse you. And thus, having the concepts at hand can be useful, but it's certainly not enough. So what I would say about flashcards is that they are certainly great and probably the best tool we have to remember arbitrary facts better, but just keep in mind that they're not everything, and just because you do 1,000 cards per day doesn't guarantee you'll have a great score. And in fact, I would argue that the time you spend doing unnecessary cards on the things that are not that relevant or that difficult for you is time you're not spending doing questions, which, as we'll touch upon in a moment, they actually do test you not only the fact, but all of the ways in which that fact can be presented, and thus are much more difficult and much more like an enriching experience for people to understand, learn, and see how these few concepts can appear on the actual test. So who should use flashcards? I'd probably say that anyone who passed the beginner stage. Because you see, when you're a pure beginner, everything you learn seems important. And I've literally seen how first years end up with 30 plus flashcards after watching a single video on anything, on the sarcomere for instance. And 30 cards doesn't seem like much at first, but when you have 30 cards for each single subject in the step 1, you quickly end up with tens of thousands of cards for all of the subjects. And that's the point where the opportunity cost of doing way too many cards kicks in and hurts your score overall, since again you are devoting the time you could spend doing all the resources that actually help you adapt to just help you recall the simple facts. Now, one extra thing you should probably know about flashcards is that you can either do them yourself or use a pre-made deck. And I get that it's tempting to use the latter since you get to save on the creation time. However, just keep in mind that those pre-made decks can be a double-edged sword, because you do save up on the creation time. However, the time you save on that creation department is wasted, since you have to understand that most pre-made decks test most concepts about most topics. And in my experience, very few people struggle with all of the concepts in all of the topics. A lot of the people usually have a few subjects that they really struggle with, and in my opinion, we should devote the time to create flashcards and repeat those facts over and over again, to just focus on the concepts for those few subjects that we really struggle with. For everything else, we're really better off by using something that helps us recall, but also in a much context-rich way, like using QBanks. And thus, that's why I think that pre-made decks can be a double-edged sword, because yes, you're saving time in one department, but you're wasting time in the department that forces you to go over a bunch of things that are not that relevant, not that useful, or not that difficult for you. So in my opinion, unless you find all things about all topics equally difficult, I think you'd be better off creating your own cards. But again, that's just my opinion. Okay, so now we move on to notes, and I already have a bunch of videos dedicated to this topic, because I do think that this is where most people get confused. You see, notes themselves are awesome. It's one of the best tools we have to help people organize complex information, to internalize it, deconstruct it, rearrange it, etc, etc, etc. So yes, notes are amazing, but there's a couple of problems. The first one is that people use them for stuff that makes absolutely no sense. Things like rereading them multiple times trying to memorize the content. Like, no. We've studied this, we know that's one of the worst strategies to help with retention. If you really want to memorize stuff, if that's your only objective, we know that instead of writing stuff down, you should be making flashcards, because again, it's an active study tool. Now, the other problem is that they are very time consuming to make. And here's where you enter the realm of its usefulness really depends entirely on your scenario. Because if, let's say, you're 3 years away from your exam and you love taking notes and you use them to help to understand the topics, and maybe you will use them also to do things outside of the USMLE, hey, by all means take your notes. But if you're 6 months out and you're still having problems remembering stuff, if that's your main concern, that you're forgetting everything you're learning and you're still getting questions wrong, well, you might want to reconsider how you spend your time with notes. Because in my opinion, notes aren't really the solution. You have to do strategies and use tools that help you recall and adapt, not understand. And again, think about the game you're playing. You're playing a game where you need to learn and review several times 500 to 10,000 unique medical topics. And there you are spending a whole afternoon taking notes on a couple of videos. Does that sound logical to you? Well, again, maybe if you have years to prep, but not at all if you have 3 months to do so. So again, ask yourself, why are you taking notes? Are you using them as a weak alternative to flashcards or to understand better? And if you're using them for the latter, are you sure you're devoting your time to understand specifically the script in which you'll be tested on? Or are you just understanding a bunch of things that won't never appear in the exam? So yeah, all of that is to say that notes could be a useful tool for those students that A, have the time to actually take them, and B, take them to understand the information better instead of just as a pathetic alternative to flashcards. Okay, finally we pass to talk about QBanks, and I already have an in-depth video explaining why I think that QBanks rock. The TLDR of that video is that QBanks are basically the perfect mix of books, notes, and flashcards, all in one package and all with the huge upside that they reflect the proportion of concepts that show in the exam. So not only is it a perfect mix of books, notes, and flashcards, but it also teaches you the script that you'll actually get tested on. Like, what more can you ask? And a lot of the people I know of refrain from using QBanks heavily in their prep, at least in the first stages of their prep, because they have a fundamental belief that you're supposed to first learn and then apply. You cannot just go and apply all of a sudden. But what I would say to those people is that one of the best ways to learn is to apply. Like, for example, just say that, let's just take the example of airplanes. How many times have you seen the airplane simulation with the lady showing you how to put the safety vest on? A bunch of times, like everybody has. And yet, time and time again, when people are actually tested on how to put the damn thing on, everybody fails the test. However, and this is the cool part, once those people that fail the test receive feedback, they end up with a much better understanding of how the damn thing actually works. They learned. And they learned not because they received another demo like all of us receive when we jump on a plane over and over again, but because they got tested. And the same thing happens with the USMLE. At first you'll feel like a bumbling band of baboons, because what the hell do you know? You don't even know what you think you're supposed to know. But as questions start to repeat themselves over and over again, because they do, you'll see that your score starts to go up, and you see that the question that you previously got wrong, you start to get right. So yeah, you just have to trust the process, and you just have to keep going. Many people just start doing a bunch of questions, they get discouraged because they get all of them wrong. But just remember, you're getting them wrong because it's the first time you actually keep getting tested. It's not because you're ignorant, it's not because you're never gonna learn. If you just keep doing them and the questions start to repeat themselves over and over again, you'll start to get them right. Now, the only thing that you really have to keep in mind about QBanks is that not all of them are similar to the exam. The two of them that come the closest are UWorld and AMBAS, and I always recommend leaving those two for the last few months of your prep. All of the other ones, you can do them pretty much whenever you want, or maybe use them as a complementary QBank, and they're all awesome and a great way to learn. And I really don't think this is necessary, but just in case you're wondering, yes, they do help you understand, recall, and adapt. All three of the skills that you're supposed to do in the USMLE. Okay, so to sum up, we have a bunch of amazing resources, and all of them are good for something. Teaching books, audios, and videos are good for understanding. Teaching books make more sense for beginners or people who are a long way from presenting their exam. Videos tend to be a bit shorter, and thus are awesome for a rapid review of the subject for the guys that don't have that much time available, but still want to learn. And audios can be great, but mostly use them as a passive learning tool while you're doing something else. Flashcards are a great tool to help you recall. Just keep in mind that they work best when you create them yourself to target your specific weaknesses. Also, it is best if you wait until you know a bit more about the subject, because otherwise you'll end up with way too many cards. Now, QBanks have pretty much everything. They help you understand, recall, adapt, and they teach you the script like nothing else we have. It makes more sense to use the QBanks that are most similar to the exam for the last few months of your prep, and before that you can still use QBanks, just use the other ones we have available. Libraries are an overall great accessory to add for everyone almost regardless of their prepping stage, but just keep in mind that trying to finish them is a very difficult if not impossible feat, and they can also get quite expensive in the long term. I suggest you use them in an as needed basis. And if you really want to use a rapid review book, in my opinion, it makes the most sense to use it at the end of your prep in the last month or so as a checklist to see if you need to review a given topic more thoroughly or if you're good with what you know. But in any case, that was all for this video. I hope it was useful. I hope it was clear. As always, thanks for tuning in and I'll see you guys in the next video.